Have you ever wondered, from which country are you listening tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? Perhaps it is late evening, perhaps the middle of the night, or maybe the early hours of the morning. Wherever you are, welcome to this calm journey through history. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, I kindly invite you to gently tap like, subscribe, and if you wish, activate the small notification bell so you can join me again whenever you want to drift off to sleep with history as your companion. Now, let us begin our story softly, with no rush at all. The Middle Ages were a time of castles, small villages, winding dirt roads, and markets filled with the sound of everyday life. People rose with the sun and worked with the rhythm of the seasons. There were no machines as we know them today, only the steady hands of farmers, bakers, weavers, and blacksmiths. Daily life moved at a gentle pace, much slower than the speed of the world we know now. It was a time of simple living, of long winters and short summers, where every day held both struggle and quiet beauty. Yet into this world of simplicity came a shadow that few could have imagined. It did not announce itself with thunder or lightning. Instead, it appeared slowly, quietly, spreading from place to place, without clear explanation. The people of the Middle Ages did not yet understand germs, bacteria, or invisible causes of sickness. What they saw was that neighbors began to fall ill, families began to suffer, and entire communities faced something they could not fully explain. At first, there was confusion. Villagers whispered questions to one another. Was it the air that had turned strange? Was it food that had spoiled? Or perhaps some other unseen reason that moved quietly through the land? In a time when knowledge was limited, explanations came not from science, but from the human need to make sense of hardship. And so, people searched for reasons, some near and simple, others far and difficult to believe. Imagine a small, medieval village. The houses are made of wood and stone, the streets narrow and uneven. Children play in the open, their laughter rising above the sound of animals and carts. And then, one day, silence begins to replace the laughter. A sickness arrives, though no one can quite see it. It lingers, it spreads, and slowly, life in the village begins to change. The pace of daily life, once steady and predictable, becomes marked by uncertainty. Farmers worry about who will tend the fields if their families fall ill. Bakers wonder if customers will return. Markets grow quiet as fewer people venture outside. And across the countryside, news travels slowly, carried not by letters or newspapers, but by word of mouth from one traveler to the next. Though the shadow of the plague was heavy, people still tried to hold on to small routines. A mother might prepare bread for her children, even if fear lingered in her heart. A father might mend a tool, knowing it could help provide food for another day. These quiet acts of normal life gave comfort, reminding families that even in uncertain times, they could still find moments of purpose. The sound of bells often marked the hours in towns and villages. They rang in the morning, at noon, and in the evening. In times of sickness, the bells also rang for other reasons, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as signs of gatherings, and at times to mark the loss of neighbors. Their echo carried across rooftops and fields, a reminder of both time and change. Travelers passing through the countryside brought not only goods, but also stories. A merchant arriving at a new town might share news of villages he had seen before. In this way, word of the strange illness spread from one place to another. Some stories grew larger with each telling, filled with worry and exaggeration. Others were softer, carrying only whispers of caution. Yet in both, there was the sense of something moving quietly across the land. As the days passed, the people of the Middle Ages began to understand one simple truth. Life was no longer the same. What had been familiar was changing. The rhythm of work, the gatherings at markets, even the sound of laughter in the streets of it felt touched by uncertainty. And yet, amid this quiet fear, there was still resilience. People continued, step by step, as history carried them forward into one of the most challenging times of their age. In some towns, people began to notice patterns, even if they did not fully understand them. They observed that the sickness seemed to spread faster in crowded places, where homes stood close together and families lived side by side. Villages tucked away in the countryside sometimes felt safer, though isolation brought its own struggles. It was not just illness that weighed on the people, but also the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. The feeling of safety became fragile, like the thin walls of a wooden house facing a storm. And yet, there were moments of hope. Families found comfort in the warmth of a fire at night, where the glow softened the fears of the day. They shared stories, old songs, and gentle words to pass the time, reminding one another that life was not only about hardship but also about togetherness. These evenings became a small shelter, a quiet pause in the storm that surrounded them. Even when the world felt unsteady, human connection offered calmness that no illness could take away. The sight of nature also brought quiet reassurance. Fields still turned green in spring, rivers still flowed, and birds still sang as they always had. To the people of the Middle Ages, these signs reminded them that the world continued in its own rhythm, regardless of the troubles of mankind. They may not have had the language of science to explain these things, but they understood that the one who controls nature allowed it to provide comfort. To look at a simple flower blooming was to feel, even briefly, that life would go on. Over time, some communities tried to take simple steps for protection. They carried small bundles of herbs, believing the pleasant smell might shield them from harm. They cleaned their homes as best they could, even if their methods were limited. They looked for patterns, made guesses, and tested small changes in daily life. Though their knowledge was imperfect, the effort to act gave them strength. It was less about the certainty of success, and more about the feeling of doing anything to protect their families. Travel between towns grew quieter. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims became still. Inns stood empty. Markets had fewer stalls, and voices that once filled the air were missing. People learned to live with less movement, with fewer connections to the outside world. For some, this was a challenge, as trade and travel had always been part of life. For others, the slower pace brought moments of calm, though it was colored by the constant shadow of uncertainty. Children, too, noticed the changes. Where once there were games in the streets and laughter in the fields, there was now more quiet. Parents kept their children closer, guarding them with extra care. Stories and simple tasks at home replaced the freedom of open play, though young children sensed the difference in the air. And yet, even then, a child's laughter would sometimes break through, a reminder that innocence still found its way into even the most difficult times. Each community experienced the plague differently. In some places, it passed quickly, leaving only memories and lessons. In others, it lingered, reshaping daily life for months or even years. There was no single story, but many small ones woven together. A neighbor helping another, a family learning to adapt, a village finding new ways to live. The human story of endurance, though quiet, left its mark on the centuries that followed. Through all of this, the most powerful response was not in grand acts, but in small ones. A shared loaf of bread, a kind word, a neighbor leaving food at another's door. These were the ways people coped. The sickness may have spread in silence, but so too did kindness. It moved quietly through homes and villages, carrying with it the strength of community. And often it was these small gestures that helped people endure the hardest days. Looking back now, across centuries of distance, the story of how people coped in the Middle Ages reminds us of resilience. It shows us that even in a time without modern medicine, without technology, and with only limited knowledge, humanity still found ways to continue. They faced fear with caution, they faced loss with compassion, and they faced uncertainty with patience. The details may feel far away, but the emotions are familiar. They remind us of our shared humanity across time, and so we close this quiet beginning of the story. We have walked through a world of simple villages, slow lives, and sudden trials. We have seen how confusion gave way to small acts of hope, and how communities tried to endure. Before we move on to the next part of this journey, I invite you to share a gentle thought in the comments. You might tell me from which country you are listening, or what time it is where you are, just as we wondered at the start. In this way, the story continues, not only in history, but in the quiet connections we share tonight. At the very beginning of the plague, when the first cases appeared, people in medieval Europe did not immediately recognize what was happening. They had no word for pandemic, no concept of invisible germs, and very little medical knowledge compared to what we know today. What they did notice, however, was that their neighbors began to fall ill, one after another, and the ordinary rhythm of life was suddenly broken. The questions that followed were filled with worry. What was this strange sickness, and why had it arrived? For many, the first reaction was confusion. A farmer might wait to find his animals calm and his fields unchanged. Yet, in the village, friends and family were unwell. How could something so powerful strike people while leaving everything else untouched? In the absence of clear answers, rumors grew. Each person added their own guess, and slowly a patchwork of explanations spread as quickly as the illness itself. One common thought was that the air itself had turned harmful. In medieval times, people believed that foul smells and heavy air carried disease. When the plague struck, many were convinced that unseen poisons floated in the breeze. This belief encouraged families to burn herbs or carry sweet-smelling flowers in hopes of cleansing the air around them. Even though we know now that the real cause was different in their time, this practice was an attempt to find safety in a world of uncertainty. Others suspected that food might be to blame. A spoiled loaf of bread, a barrel of grain gone bad, or even the water from a local well, these were easy targets for suspicion. People knew that when food spoiled, it could make them sick, so it seemed natural to extend that idea to the plague. While these guesses were not accurate, they reflected a simple truth. People were searching for answers in the small details of daily life, trying to explain what they could not see. In some places, the illness was blamed on travelers. Merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as if they had brought the sickness with them from distant lands. Villagers closed their gates to strangers, hoping to protect themselves by keeping outsiders away. Though this fear often created barriers between communities, it also showed how deeply people longed to feel safe, even when safety seemed impossible. Fear also spread through whispers about the heavens. Some believed the strange sickness was a sign of punishment or the result of natural events in the sky. Unusual weather, eclipses, or the appearance of comets were thought to influence life on Earth. Without the tools of modern science, it was natural for people to look upward and wonder if the answer lay above them. These explanations, though uncertain, gave a sense of order to something that otherwise felt chaotic. Within households, reactions varied. Some families clung to hope and tried to continue their routines. Others grew fearful, withdrawing from neighbors and limiting contacts. A simple visit to the market, once an ordinary task, became filled with unease. Each cough or sneeze carried suspicion, and people began to view even familiar faces with caution. Daily life was no longer just about work and rest, it was about avoiding danger that seemed invisible. As word of the sickness spread, so too did advice. Healers, wise women, and traveling physicians offered suggestions, each based on the knowledge of their time. Some recommended carrying herbs, others advised avoiding certain foods, and still others suggested staying indoors. Though these methods were often ineffective, the act of giving advice provided comfort. It showed that people were not simply helpless, they were willing to try, to act, to resist in any way they could. The first reactions, though filled with uncertainty, reveal something important about human nature. In the face of the unknown, people search for meaning. They ask questions, create explanations, and look for patterns. Even when their answers are incomplete, the effort to understand becomes a way to cope. In this way, the people of the Middle Ages remind us that confusion itself can be a first step toward resilience. Still, fear lingered in every corner. Streets grew quiet, markets less crowded, and conversations hushed. The plague was not only a sickness of the body, it was also a test of the mind and spirit. People lived between hope and dread, clinging to small routines while carrying heavy uncertainty. This was the fragile balance of the first reactions when the shadow of the plague had only just begun to fall. In the villages where the plague appeared, one of the earliest collective responses was to seek distance. Families closed their doors, neighbors avoided long conversations, and gatherings became rare. This instinctive act of isolation, though born out of fear, became one of the most important ways communities tried to protect themselves. It was not easy, because human life thrived on connection, but survival demanded caution, and so silence often replaced the sound of busy streets. The presence of sickness created visible changes in social life. A handshake, once a sign of trust, was now something to be avoided. Sharing a meal, once filled with laughter, became more cautious. Even festivals and celebrations were reduced or postponed, as people feared that joy might carry hidden danger. These adjustments were not simply physical, they reshaped the emotional landscape of entire towns. In larger towns and cities, leaders faced difficult choices. Some ordered restrictions on markets, while others limited travel in and out of their walls. These measures were imperfect, but they reflected a growing awareness that collective behavior could influence survival. The idea that communities must work together, even with limited knowledge, was a powerful step in coping with the unknown. It was a lesson born from necessity, carried out in real time. Yet even with caution, fear often pushed people to extremes. Some tried to escape by leaving crowded towns for the countryside, hoping the fresh air would protect them. Others clung tightly to routines, convincing themselves that life could continue as usual. Both responses reveal the same truth. In times of uncertainty, people seek comfort in what feels familiar, whether it is action or denial. The balance between fear and hope shaped every decision. Stories, too, spread alongside the sickness. Travelers carried not only goods, but also tales of villages struck by illness. Some stories grew exaggerated, filled with strange details and imagined causes. Others were soft and hesitant, carrying only fragments of truth. Regardless of accuracy, these stories influenced how people reacted, adding layers of fear, suspicion, or sometimes determination. In this way, the plague was not only biological, but also deeply social. The most human reactions were often seen at home. Families gathered in small circles, comforting one another with words, food, or prayer. A mother would hum to her children, a father might speak gently by the fire, and siblings shared quiet company. These moments of closeness became essential, for in the shadow of illness, love and compassion offered strength that no remedy could match. To endure together was, in itself, a form of survival. Over time, people began to notice that not everyone reacted the same way. Some individuals grew more cautious, carefully avoiding crowds and following every suggestion to stay safe. Others became restless, ignoring warnings and moving about as usual. These differences created tension as communities struggled between the pull of safety and the pull of normal life. It showed that coping with hardship is never uniform. It is shaped by personality, circumstance, and choice. Despite fear, there was resilience in these first reactions. People adapted, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in larger shifts. They adjusted their habits, rethought their gatherings, and altered the rhythm of their days. These changes, though difficult, demonstrated a powerful instinct for survival. It was not about perfect solutions, but about small acts that allowed life to continue despite uncertainty. Looking back, the early reactions to the plague may seem limited compared to modern knowledge. But within them is a timeless lesson. When faced with the unknown, humanity searches for meaning, takes action, and leans on community. These first steps, though imperfect, were part of a larger story of resilience. They reveal how people, even centuries ago, responded with courage in the face of fear. And with this, we close the second segment of our journey through the Middle Ages. If you found calm in this story, I invite you gently to subscribe, so you may join again when the next tale is ready. In our following exploration, we will step even further back in time and ask a new question. How did people survive the Ice Age? Until then, may this quiet history stay with you as you drift peacefully into rest. When the plague spread through towns and villages in the Middle Ages, one of the earliest and most common responses was the search for protection. People did not know the real cause of the sickness, but they did know how it made them feel: vulnerable, worried, and uncertain about tomorrow. To cope, they began to look for objects, habits, and simple actions that could create a sense of safety. This was not just about physical survival, it was about calming the mind in a time when answers were few. The very act of doing something, even if it was small, gave people strength. One of the most widespread practices was the use of herbs and flowers. Fragrant plants such as lavender, rosemary, sage, and thyme were carefully gathered and carried in little pouches or tucked into clothing. People believed that these pleasant smells could cleanse the air and protect them from harm. In reality, the herbs did not stop the sickness, but they offered comfort. And as we reflect on this practice, we can understand that the one who controls life may allow comfort to come through such simple creations, reminding humans of calm, even in moments of fear. The practice of burning herbs also became common. Families would place rosemary, juniper, or even dried pine into small fires inside their homes. The smoke filled the rooms, and people breathed it in with hope that it would drive away the invisible danger. The act of burning plants was less about the science and more about ritual, something that created a feeling of action in a situation where many felt powerless. And though we now know smoke does not prevent disease, for them, it was a symbol of protection. Perfumes and scented waters were also used in towns. Wealthier families sometimes soaked cloths in rose water, then held them to their noses when moving through crowded places. Others dipped sponges in vinegar, convinced that sharp smells would drive away illness. These practices spread across Europe, shaping how people carried themselves in daily life. Even the simple act of smelling something pleasant gave relief, a reminder that comfort could still be found. And in a world filled with fear, comfort was a precious form of protection. Another belief was that smoke in the streets could keep towns safe. In some cities, fires were set in public squares, and aromatic woods were burned throughout the day. Officials thought that if enough smoke filled the air, it might cleanse the entire atmosphere. Villagers walking past these fires often felt reassured, even if only for a moment. The sight of flames, the smell of herbs, and the collective effort of the community created a sense that people were fighting back, however imperfectly. Clothing, too, became part of protection. Some people wore long coats and gloves when venturing outside, believing that covering the skin would block illness. Wealthier individuals sometimes lined their garments with scented materials, carrying protection with them wherever they went. In towns where physicians wore the infamous long cloaks and strange beaked masks filled with herbs, the image of protection became a symbol in itself. It was a visual reminder that humans were not surrendering, but searching for defense. Windows were often kept shut in homes, especially during the night. Families believed that fresh night air carried illness, so they preferred to stay enclosed. In contrast, others kept windows open in the day, hoping sunlight and breeze would carry sickness away. These conflicting practices show how uncertain people were, and yet how determined they were to make choices, no matter how small, to shield themselves. Each decision was made with the hope of survival, reflecting the human will to live. Animals were sometimes thought to offer protection, too. Cats and dogs were kept close, and their behavior was carefully watched. Some believed animals could sense danger before humans did, while others thought their presence kept evil away. In truth, the animals offered companionship more than physical protection, but that companionship gave people strength. A dog lying by the fire, or a cat curled on a lap, was a reminder that not everything in the world had changed. Life still held familiar comforts, even in times of fear. Symbols of protection also appeared in the way people decorated their homes. Charms were placed above doorways, not as objects of worship, but as signs of hope and reassurance. Families hung herbs in windows, drew simple marks on walls, or placed items near beds. These acts were not about magic, but about creating a sense of security in the mind. When life feels fragile, even small gestures can build courage. The medieval home became both shelter and symbol, protecting body and spirit together. And while many of these methods did not prevent illness, they shaped how people lived through it. The search for protection was not only about health, it was about hope. Each pouch of herbs, each fire in the street, each scented cloth represented a step toward calm. They remind us that in history, as today, humans turn to the tools they know, imperfect though they may be. And within those tools, the deeper story is not one of guaranteed safety, but of resilience. The people of the Middle Ages remind us that seeking protection, even in small ways, is part of what makes us human. The idea of carrying small protective objects also became part of daily life. Some families tied small pouches of herbs to belts, while children were given tokens to hold in their hands. These tokens were not worshipped, but they served as reminders of care, often given by parents or grandparents with gentle words. Holding on to something familiar gave children courage when fear spread among adults. In this way, simple items became symbols of comfort, woven into the rhythm of life during uncertain times. Communities also began to notice the importance of cleanliness, even if their understanding was limited. Some households washed bedding more often, scrubbed floors, and kept waste away from living spaces. Town leaders sometimes ordered the cleaning of streets or the removal of trash to refresh the air. Though they did not know about bacteria, these small efforts at cleanliness were among the earliest steps toward healthier practices. It shows how even without modern science, people observed patterns and tried to improve their environment to feel safer. In wealthier towns, perfumed oils and scented gloves became common among the upper classes. Merchants sold mixtures of rose, mint, or citrus scents for people to carry with them in small bottles. These were luxury items, but they reflected the same desire for protection that ordinary villagers sought with herbs and fires. The difference lay only in the materials, not in the fear or the hope behind them. No matter the social class, the instinct to defend against the unseen danger was shared by all. Travelers and healers often carried special staffs or sticks, using them to avoid direct contact with others. A handshake could be replaced with a gesture from afar, and tools were used to pass items without touching hands. These habits slowly became part of daily life, reducing the closeness that once defined community life. The change was difficult, but it revealed an early understanding that distance might provide safety. It was one more way people shaped their behavior to cope with uncertainty. Even the design of homes was adjusted in some places. Families moved their beds away from windows, kept fresh bundles of herbs near doorways, and placed fires in central rooms. The arrangement of furniture became a quiet form of protection, as people experimented with ways to make their living spaces feel safer. These changes may seem small, but they reflected constant awareness of the unseen threat outside. Every detail of daily life was shaped by the desire to endure. The clergy and community leaders often encouraged the use of protective habits. They reminded families to remain careful, to avoid unnecessary gatherings, and to take whatever measures were available to guard health. In some towns, groups of volunteers helped clean public spaces or distribute herbs to the poor. These collective actions revealed that protection was not only an individual pursuit, but also a shared responsibility. Communities that worked together, even imperfectly, found reassurance in unity. Over time, some protective practices became traditions, remembered even after the plague passed. The use of herbs, scented pouches, and vinegar washes appeared again in later outbreaks. Families passed down stories of how their ancestors had tried to guard themselves, adding layers of memory to each object and ritual. Though not always effective, these traditions gave people a sense of connection to the past. They felt they were continuing the same struggle as those before them, bound together by history. For children, the protective rituals often felt like games. Carrying a pouch of flowers, watching fires in the streets, or smelling a piece of scented cloth became small distractions from fear. Parents encouraged these habits gently, turning them into routines that gave children comfort. Even in hardship, there was care in how protection was taught, softened, shaped, and made less frightening. This shows us that survival was not only about fighting sickness, but also about protecting the spirit of the next generation. The search for protection, however limited, helped people believe that they were not powerless. Whether through herbs, smoke, clothing, or simple routines, each act gave families the sense that they could push back against danger. This belief mattered because despair weakens the heart, but hope strengthens it. And so, these protective habits were more than rituals, they were lifelines for the human spirit. They carried people forward, day by day, through the shadow of the plague. And so we close this segment on seeking protection. We have walked through streets filled with smoke, homes decorated with herbs, and families carrying small symbols of safety. These practices may seem distant now, but their meaning remains close. Humans seek calm when the world feels uncertain. If you are still with me, gently let your mind rest on that thought. And if you wish to hear the next part of this story, consider staying with the channel, for soon we will explore how people learned to live apart in segment 4, Staying Apart. As the plague continued to spread through towns and villages, people began to notice a pattern. Those who lived close together seemed to fall ill more quickly than those who stayed apart. This observation, though simple, shaped one of the earliest protective habits of the Middle Ages: separation. Families, neighbors, and even entire towns decided that distance was safer than closeness. It was not easy, for human life thrives on connection, but survival demanded new ways of living. In some villages, families shut themselves inside their homes for weeks at a time. Doors were bolted, shutters were closed, and contact with outsiders was avoided. A simple knock on the door, once a friendly sound, now carried suspicion. To receive a visitor was to risk the unknown, and so most families chose silence over social life. This isolation was heavy, but it gave a fragile sense of safety. Markets, once filled with noise and color, grew quiet. Stalls were fewer, and buyers stood farther apart. Sellers handed goods with caution, sometimes placing them on tables or baskets rather than passing them directly by hand. The lively atmosphere of trade became subdued, replaced by careful distance. For many, this was the first time they truly felt how different life could become under the shadow of sickness. Travel between towns slowed as well. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims now seemed empty. Inns closed their doors, and travelers were often turned away for fear they might carry illness with them. Some towns even placed guards at their gates, refusing entry to strangers. Though these measures were harsh, they reflected a growing belief: separation might protect the healthy from the sick. Inside households, even family members practiced forms of distance. If one person showed signs of illness, they were often placed in a separate room, away from the rest. Food was delivered carefully, and contact was reduced. Though heartbreaking, this practice gave families hope that the sickness could be contained. It was one of the earliest examples of what we now call quarantine, born from observation and necessity. The separation also reshaped daily routines. Religious gatherings, festivals, and weddings, all moments of joy and community, were reduced or postponed. Instead, people turned inward, finding ways to mark important days quietly at home. The absence of social life was deeply felt, but it was accepted as part of survival. A quiet evening with family replaced the noise of crowds, changing the rhythm of medieval life. Children, too, noticed the changes. Their games with friends were limited, and their time outdoors shortened. Parents kept them close, guarding them from unnecessary contact. What had once been open play in the fields became careful play in courtyards or small gardens. The world of childhood shrank, but parents hoped that limiting exposure would protect their little ones from danger. The practice of staying apart carried not only physical consequences, but also emotional ones. Loneliness became a quiet companion in many homes. People longed for the comfort of gatherings, for shared meals, and for the laughter of neighbors. Yet they endured, choosing separation over risk. The silence of distance, though heavy, became a kind of shield against fear. For healers and physicians, separation became part of their advice. They encouraged families to keep distance, to avoid crowded places, and to remain cautious. Though their knowledge was limited, their guidance reflected growing awareness that human contact could carry danger. These instructions were not always followed perfectly, but even partial efforts helped shape survival. The idea of distancing was not yet science, but it was wisdom born from experience. Despite the hardship, people found ways to adapt. Some villagers arranged for food to be left at gates, with no direct contact between giver and receiver. Others developed signals bells, calls, or marks to communicate safely across distance. These adjustments showed creativity in the face of limitation. Even when apart, communities tried to remain connected, proving that separation did not mean abandonment. It meant survival, carried out with care. In cities, the practice of separation sometimes became more organized. Officials ordered that certain neighborhoods be closed if illness spread too quickly there. Gates were locked, guards were posted, and movement was restricted. These measures, though difficult, reflected a recognition that the fewer people mixed together, the slower the sickness seemed to move. The idea of dividing space to protect the healthy became a visible part of urban life. In smaller villages, staying apart often meant that gatherings for work had to be reshaped. Farmers still needed to plant, harvest, and care for animals, but they did so with caution. Instead of large groups working side by side, smaller teams took turns in the fields. Tasks that once brought neighbors together now required distance, slowing the pace of labor. Yet, despite these challenges, the work of survival continued. Isolation also reshaped the way people experienced faith. In many places, large services were replaced by smaller, quieter gatherings. Families prayed in their homes, turning daily rituals into private acts of reflection. This was not a loss of devotion, but an adaptation and attempt to preserve spiritual strength while reducing risk. These quiet practices remind us that people sought comfort and hope even when separated from their communities. Letters and messages became important in maintaining connection. Though travel was limited, couriers still carried written words from one town to another. A simple letter reassured families that distant relatives were safe. In this way, staying apart did not mean complete silence. Human connection, even carried on parchment, gave strength across distance. It was proof that relationships could endure, even when bodies could not meet. Staying apart also influenced the design of trade. Merchants developed ways of leaving goods at agreed locations without face-to-face meetings. Payments were exchanged through intermediaries or delayed until safety was certain. These practices slowed commerce, but they also revealed adaptability. Even in crisis, people found ways to balance the need for distance with the need for survival. The economy shifted, reshaped by caution and necessity. Emotional resilience became just as important as physical protection. Families created routines to soften the weight of isolation. They sang songs together, told stories, and shared meals quietly. These small acts helped replace the missing warmth of community gatherings. In the silence of separation, the bonds within households grew stronger, becoming anchors of calm in uncertain times. Over time, people began to see separation as an act of care rather than rejection. To stay apart was to protect, not to abandon. A neighbor who kept distance was showing concern, not hostility. Slowly, this understanding reshaped social expectations teaching communities that compassion could be expressed through caution. It was a new way of showing love, one that valued safety over closeness. Still, not everyone accepted the practice easily. Some resisted isolation, longing for the familiarity of gatherings. Others doubted its effectiveness, continuing life as before. These differences created tension, but they also reflect the variety of human response to hardship. In every era, some adapt quickly, while others struggle to let go of old ways. This, too, is part of the story of staying apart. Looking back now, we can see that these early practices of distance were the foundation of ideas still used today. The simple act of limiting contact slowed the spread of illness, even if medieval people did not fully understand why. Their instincts, born from observation, carried wisdom that has echoed across centuries. It is a reminder that even without full knowledge, humans can act with remarkable foresight, and so we close this segment on staying apart. We have seen how distance reshaped towns, homes, and hearts, creating both hardship and resilience. Though silence filled the spaces once crowded with voices, people continued to adapt, to protect, and to endure. If you are still listening, let this quiet history guide you gently toward the rest. And when you return, our journey will continue into segment 5, turning to prayer and reflection, where we will explore how people sought peace in times of fear. In the silence of isolation, when families closed their doors and towns grew quiet, many people turned inward. With markets subdued and gatherings reduced, life slowed to a rhythm of waiting and watching. In these still hours, prayer and reflection became a natural response. People sought comfort in faith, looking for peace in moments of fear. This turning inward was not only about seeking protection, but also about finding calmness for the mind and heart. Medieval households often set aside times in the day for devotion. Candles were lit, voices softened, and families gathered in simple circles. Without large gatherings, the home became the center of spiritual life. Children learned to listen quietly, parents offered gentle words, and together they created a rhythm of remembrance. These practices gave structure to days that might otherwise feel uncertain, filling empty hours with purpose. For many, prayer was a way to replace fear with patience. The sound of whispered words, repeated daily, became like a heartbeat in the home. Each phrase carried hope, each pause carried reflection. Even when sickness touched their streets, people found that devotion gave them strength to face another day. It was a reminder that no hardship lasts forever, and that endurance comes through calm and trust. Reflection was not only about spoken prayer, but also about quiet thought. Farmers resting after labor, mothers watching their children, or travelers sitting by a fire, all found moments to think deeply about life and its fragility. The stillness of the plague years created space for these reflections, teaching people to value what they had. The absence of crowds revealed the importance of family, kindness, and patience. In silence, many rediscovered what mattered most. Some communities still gathered in small groups, though cautiously. Meetings were fewer and numbers smaller, but the desire to connect through prayer remained strong. People found ways to space themselves apart, or to hold gatherings outdoors where air moved freely. These efforts, though modest, showed how devotion endured even when danger surrounded them. Faith became not only personal, but also a shared strength, uniting people across distance. The sound of bells often marked hours of reflection. Church bells, once used for festivals and gatherings, now rang as reminders for prayer. Their echo carried across fields and rooftops, calling families to pause. In this way, even those who stayed apart felt connected, united by the sound that touched every household. The bells created a rhythm for communities, reminding them to turn their thoughts toward calmness and patience. For healers and caretakers, prayer offered comfort as well. Their work exposed them to sickness daily, and yet they continued to serve. In quiet moments, they sought strength through devotion, reminding themselves that endurance was possible. Their resilience was not only in their skills, but also in their hearts, strengthened by reflection. This spiritual support allowed them to carry on, even in the face of exhaustion. Children, too, were included in these practices. Parents taught them simple prayers, easy words to repeat, soft enough to calm their young minds. Stories with moral lessons were shared, reminding them of patience and kindness. These small teachings gave children a sense of stability, showing them that even in troubled times, they could find peace in faith and reflection. The lessons would remain with them long after the plague years had passed. The act of reflection also encouraged communities to show kindness. Families who had little still shared food with neighbors. Words of comfort were offered across fences, through windows, or shouted from safe distances. These acts of generosity were seen as part of devotion, ways of living out values that gave meaning in hardship. In this way, prayer was not only spoken, but also lived through action. As days stretched into weeks, the habit of reflection grew stronger. What began as a response to fear became a daily rhythm, shaping the way people endured. Each pause for prayer, each moment of silence, created space for calm. Even when answers were few, people discovered that reflection itself was a form of survival. It was a reminder that the heart, when steady, can carry the body through the hardest times. In towns where fear was strongest, prayer circles sometimes formed at night. Families stood at their doorways, each in their own home, and prayed together though apart. The voices rose softly, blending across narrow streets, carrying hope from one house to another. Though no one touched hands or embraced, the shared devotion created connection in the silence. These practices gave strength not only to individuals but to entire communities who discovered that unity could exist without closeness. Reflection also inspired creativity. Some people began writing down thoughts, keeping journals of daily life. These writings were not elaborate histories, but personal notes, lists of prayers, short reflections, or simple accounts of how each day unfolded. For them, the act of writing was itself a form of devotion, a way to give shape to thoughts and keep the mind steady. These writings now give us glimpses into how people truly lived and endured. The quiet of the plague years became a teacher. Without constant festivals, busy markets, or endless travel, people had time to consider the meaning of their actions. Many discovered patience in ways they had never experienced before. This was not a patience of passivity, but of endurancy, recognition that hardship must be met with calm strength. In the silence, people grew in wisdom, finding lessons hidden within difficulty. Reflection also brought communities to recognize the value of compassion. To care for the sick, to comfort the grieving, or to share food with the hungry. These became acts of devotion, as important as spoken prayer. In this way, the spiritual and the practical merged. Life in the plague years taught people that faith was not only about words, but also about how one treated others. It was a lesson passed quietly from household to household, shaping the spirit of survival. The plague reminded many of the fragility of life. Reflection on mortality was not morbid but meaningful. It encouraged people to treasure their families, to hold loved ones close, and to make use of their time wisely. In this sense, the hardship became a lens through which life appeared clearer. Even as sickness cast a shadow, reflection brought light to the value of each day. In some households, elders shared wisdom during these times of prayer. They spoke of earlier hardships, famines, wars, or harsh winters that communities had survived. These stories became lessons of resilience, teaching younger generations that difficulties had always been part of life, yet endurance had always carried humanity forward. Reflection on the past created courage for the present. The memory of survival became a source of strength. Music also found a place in reflection. Families hummed soft tunes, played simple instruments, or recited verses together. These sounds did not erase fear, but they softened it. Music created a bridge between sorrow and hope, offering comfort in ways words sometimes could not. In this, we see how prayer, reflection, and creativity blended together to shape endurance. As the weeks turned into months, devotion gave rhythm to the uncertainty. Even as sickness continued, the act of turning inward brought balance. Reflection was not a cure, but it was a balm, a way to soothe the restless mind and guide the heart toward calm. In the quiet practices of faith and thought, people found the strength to carry on, step by step. Their endurance was built not only in the body, but also in the spirit. Looking back now, the turning toward prayer and reflection shows us a timeless truth. Hardship is never faced by the body alone, it is carried by the heart and mind together. The people of the Middle Ages remind us that when fear surrounds us, we can still find peace within. Their devotion reveals that quiet strength is often the most enduring kind, and it is in that strength that survival becomes possible. And so we close this segment of our journey. We have seen how families, towns, and individuals turned inward for calm, finding patience and resilience through reflection. If you found peace in this quiet telling, I invite you softly to stay with the channel so you may return for the next story. In our following exploration, we will look at segment 6, Care in the Home, where we discover how families tended to one another with compassion during the hardest days. In the Middle Ages, hospitals as we know them today were rare and often far away. When sickness came, most care took place inside the home, where families did their best with the little they had. Parents tended to children, husbands and wives cared for each other, and neighbors sometimes stepped in to help when they could. These homes became the front line of endurance, filled with small acts of compassion that kept communities alive. The daily rhythm of care was simple but constant. A sick family member was given rest in the warmest corner of the home. Water was fetched from wells or rivers, herbs were prepared, and blankets were adjusted to bring comfort. Each action, though modest, carried deep meaning. For families, it was not only about trying to heal, but about showing love and presence during moments of hardship. Food was often used as medicine. Warm soups, soft bread, and fresh water were offered to the sick as often as possible. Families believed that strength could be restored through nourishment. Even when food supplies were low, households shared what they had, prioritizing the ill. This act of giving became both practical care and a demonstration of kindness, for providing comfort was as valuable as the food itself. Herbs gathered from gardens or nearby fields played an important role in home remedies. Plants such as mint, sage, and chamomile were boiled into teas or applied as poultices. Families believed these natural gifts could ease pain, reduce fever, or calm breathing. And while we now know that their effects were limited, we can still see the wisdom in turning to nature for comfort. As the Creator has placed benefits in even the simplest of plants, the act of preparing these remedies gave hope. even if the outcome was uncertain. Caring for the sick required patience. Illness often lingered for days or weeks, testing the strength of caregivers. Families took turns sitting beside their loved ones, adjusting blankets, whispering words of encouragement, or simply staying present. In these quiet moments, the home became more than shelter. It became a place of service, where endurance was measured not by medicine but by compassion. The role of mothers was often central in this care. They prepared meals, mixed herbs, and kept close watch over children and elders. Their calm presence provided reassurance, especially for the youngest in the household. Fathers also took part, fetching supplies, repairing beds, or keeping fires burning through the night. Together, parents worked as a team, balancing the demands of survival with the duty of care. Children, though young, sometimes helped in small ways. They carried water, gathered wood, or held herbs, while adults prepared remedies. These simple tasks not only eased the burden, but also gave children a sense of purpose. In difficult times, contributing to the care of family members helped them feel included, teaching lessons of responsibility and compassion that would remain with them into adulthood. Neighbors, when safe to do so, also offered help. A loaf of bread left at a doorstep, a bucket of water shared, or words of comfort spoken from a safe distance, all were acts of kindness that strengthened the bonds of community. Though fear often kept families apart, the instinct to support one another was never fully silenced. Even the smallest gestures of care carried great weight in days when survival was uncertain. The home itself was reshaped by illness. Spaces once used for work or gathering became secret rooms. Furniture was moved, windows adjusted, and fires maintained for warmth. The layout of the house reflected the needs of the moment, as every corner became dedicated to keeping loved ones comfortable. In this way, medieval homes became both shelters and places of healing, adapting to the demands of hardship. Despite the fear, acts of care created moments of peace. The sound of a lullaby sung by a mother, the touch of a hand adjusting a blanket, or the sight of a warm meal prepared with love all reminded families that compassion could shine even in darkness. These gestures did not erase the plague, but they softened its weight. Care in the home became more than survival. It became a quiet expression of humanity, showing that love endures even in times of trial. When illness entered a household, families often relied on routines to create a sense of stability. Caregivers repeated the same actions day after day, preparing teas, changing cloths, checking temperatures by touch, and offering sips of water. These repetitions, though simple, gave rhythm to the uncertainty. For the sick, it was a reminder that they were not forgotten. For caregivers, the rituals provided purpose, something steady to hold on to in a world that felt unpredictable. Cleanliness was another part of home care, though it was practiced differently than today. Families washed bedding in rivers, scrubbed floors with water and ash, and kept fresh air moving through windows when possible. These acts may not have eliminated illness, but they created an environment that felt calmer and healthier. By keeping the home tidy and organized, families showed their loved ones that care extended beyond the body, embraced the space around them as well. The sharing of remedies across households also became common. A neighbor might pass along a recipe for a tea or instructions for boiling certain herbs. Families compared notes on what seemed to help and what did not. This exchange of knowledge was informal, yet deeply valuable. It turned small communities into networks of care, where wisdom was shared not for profit, but for survival and compassion. Sometimes, the effort of care weighed heavily on families. Long nights without rest, The fear of losing loved ones and the strain of constant attention left caregivers exhausted. Yet even in this exhaustion, they continued. The act of staying beside the sick, of refusing to abandon them, became a quiet form of bravery. It showed that courage is not always loud or grand. It can be the simple endurance of caring for another person, hour after hour. For those who recovered, gratitude filled the home. Families celebrated quietly, thankful for strength restored. The experience of illness often deepened bonds between family members who had faced hardship together and emerged stronger. Recovery also gave hope to others, proving that survival was possible even when fear suggested otherwise. These moments of healing reminded communities that endurance could bring light after darkness. Even when outcomes were painful, the care itself carried meaning. Families took comfort in knowing they had done their best, offering love and effort in the face of hardship. The presence of compassion softened grief, reminding survivors that they had not failed. In this way, care in the home was never wasted, for it gave dignity to those who suffered and strength to those who endured. Children who witnessed these acts of care often carried the lessons forward. They grew up remembering the patience of their parents, the kindness of neighbors, and the importance of staying close to loved ones in times of need. These lessons shaped the next generation, passing down values of compassion and resilience. The plague years, though dark, became a teacher, instilling virtues that outlasted the sickness itself. The act of caregiving also reinforced community bonds. When one family showed kindness, others were encouraged to do the same. A loaf of bread shared, a blanket lent, or a bucket of water carried across a street, these were small gifts that multiplied in meaning. In times of hardship, generosity became contagious, spreading hope in ways illness never could. Through care, the human spirit proved stronger than despair. Looking back, the image of care in the home is one of quiet strength. There were no modern hospitals, no advanced medicines, and no certain cures. Yet, there was love, patience, and resilience. These were the true remedies of the Middle Ages, keeping families together when fear might have torn them apart. They remind us that survival is not only about the body, but also about the bonds of the heart. And so we close this segment of our journey. We have walked through medieval homes, watched families care for one another, and seen how compassion became a shield against despair. If this story has given you calm, I invite you gently to stay with the channel, for soon we will continue into segment 7, the role of healers. There, we will discover how traveling physicians, with their curious masks and determined hearts, offered help in uncertain times. In the Middle Ages, not every household could manage illness alone. While families cared for one another as best they could, there were times when help from outside was needed. This is where healers, physicians, wise women, apothecaries, and wandering caretakers entered the story. They were not always many in number, but their presence carried meaning. In the shadow of fear, they represented both knowledge and service, offering guidance when little seemed certain. Healers of this time used tools and practices that reflected the limited medical understanding of their age. They studied old texts, relied on herbal remedies, and observed patterns in illness. Some had training from schools, while others learned through experience passed down from elders. Their knowledge was imperfect, yet their willingness to act made them valuable. In a world of uncertainty, any sign of care offered comfort. One of the most recognizable images from this period is the physician's long cloak and beaked mask. Inside the mask, herbs and fragrant materials were placed, meant to filter the air and protect the healer from danger. Though we now know it was ineffective, The sight of the costume left an impression on communities. It showed that even in fear, people attempted to create barriers between themselves and the sickness. The healer's strange clothing became a symbol of resilience. Apothecaries played another important role. They prepared mixtures of herbs, oils, and powders, selling them to families who hoped to ease symptoms. Their shops often smelled of rosemary, sage, and vinegar. Customers arrived quietly, each searching for a cure, or at least some comfort. Even when remedies failed to heal, the act of receiving them gave families hope, which was itself a kind of medicine. In rural areas, wise women and local healers filled the gap where trained physicians could not reach. They gathered plants from fields, mixed poultices, and shared advice rooted in generations of observation. Their remedies might calm a cough, soothe pain, or simply provide reassurance. Though their methods were simple, their role was vital. They offered presence when isolation felt unbearable, reminding families that they were not alone. Traveling physicians faced unique challenges. Moving from town to town, they risked carrying sickness with them, but they also carried news and knowledge. In each village, they observed symptoms, tried treatments, and shared what they had learned from previous stops. This exchange of information, though limited, helped communities adapt. It showed that even without modern science, people could spread wisdom alongside remedies. The work of healers was not easy. They were exposed to illness daily, often without protection beyond their cloaks and masks. Many fell ill themselves, becoming victims of the very sickness they sought to fight. Yet, their decision to serve reflected bravery. They stood in places others avoided, guided not only by knowledge, but by duty. Their presence, fragile though it was, gave people courage. Not all healers were welcomed equally. Some were respected and trusted, while others faced suspicion. Fear sometimes turned communities against those who failed to cure the sick. In desperate times, disappointment could become anger, and healers were blamed for outcomes beyond their control. This revealed the heavy burden they carried, to bring hope, while knowing they could not guarantee results. Despite these challenges, the role of healers shaped the story of the plague. Their remedies, their advice, and even their symbolic presence gave structure to the chaos. They reminded people that illness was not met only with fear but also with effort. Even if cures were incomplete, the act of trying mattered deeply. It was a testament to human determination in the face of despair. As the plague spread, healers became travelers of both medicine and morale. They carried herbs, tools, and knowledge, but also words of reassurance. To knock on a door, to step into a sick room, and to offer care, these actions spoke louder than the remedies themselves. They showed that compassion could walk hand in hand with knowledge, creating a light in the darkest of times. Their footsteps marked a path of service across a fearful landscape. Some healers combined observation with faith, reminding families to stay calm and patient. They encouraged rest, fresh air when possible, and the use of herbs to soothe pain. Though their methods were far from modern science, their presence gave families reassurance. In difficult times, the human voice, spoken with care, could feel as important as any medicine. Healers became not only providers of remedies, but also guardians of morale. The relationship between healers and communities was built on trust. A physician who stayed through hardship earned respect, even if results were uncertain. Villagers valued those who showed consistency, those who did not flee when fear was greatest. In this way, the healer's role was as much about loyalty as about knowledge. To remain present in danger was itself an act of service, remembered long after sickness had passed. Sometimes, healers worked together, sharing their experiences. A traveling physician might compare notes with a local apothecary, testing which herbs seemed most effective. These exchanges created small networks of knowledge that stretched across regions. Though fragmented, the sharing of wisdom allowed communities to feel less isolated. Each conversation, each record, became part of a larger effort to understand the plague. The healer's work also revealed the limits of knowledge in the Middle Ages. Many treatments did little to stop the sickness, and outcomes were often determined by factors beyond human control. Yet, within these limitations, healers still made a difference. They eased suffering, offered comfort, and inspired hope. Even when healing was incomplete, their efforts preserved dignity for those in pain. Healers also influenced how families viewed illness. Their advice shaped behavior, encouraging isolation, the use of herbs, or the burning of fires in homes and streets. Though the science was not exact, these practices sometimes slowed the spread of disease. By following the words of healers, communities found a sense of order in the chaos. The presence of guidance, however imperfect, gave direction to fearful days. The image of the beaked physician mask remains one of the most enduring symbols of the plague. Though we now see it as strange and ineffective, in its time it was a representation of human ingenuity. It was a visual sign that people would not surrender quietly, that they would attempt to create defenses, however limited. The healer's costume, unsettling as it appeared, became a reminder of courage in the face of fear. Stories of healers traveled far, carried by word of mouth. Some were remembered for their compassion, visiting homes at great personal risk. Others became symbols of failure, blamed when cures did not work. These stories reflected the deep emotions of communities living through hardship. They also reveal the heavy responsibility placed upon those who sought to help, often without clear tools or answers. Despite uneven outcomes, healers were essential to the story of the Middle Ages. They represented the determination to act, even when success was uncertain. Their footsteps through towns, their voices in sick rooms, and their remedies prepared with care became part of the larger fabric of survival. In them, we see the timeless human instinct to protect, to serve, and to endure. Looking back now, the role of healers offers lessons for us today. It shows that even in times of limited knowledge, effort matters. Care is not always about perfect cures, it is also about presence, compassion, and courage. The healers of the Middle Ages remind us that human beings have always tried to meet hardship with service. Their legacy is one of resilience, carried quietly through history. And so we close this segment on the role of healers. We have walked alongside physicians in their cloaks, apothecaries in their shops, and wise women gathering herbs in the fields. Each of them, in their own way, brought comfort to fearful communities. If this story has calmed you, I invite you gently to remain with the channel. Soon, we will continue into segment 8, the power of community, where we will explore how neighbors supported one another in times of trial. When fear spread across villages and towns during the plague, people discovered that survival was not only about herbs, remedies, or distance. It was also about the quiet strength of community. Neighbors who helped one another, families who shared what little they had, and groups who worked together to endure hardship created a kind of protection that was stronger than any single remedy. This was the power of community, a shield built not of walls or weapons, but of compassion. In many villages, food was shared even when supplies were scarce. A family with extra bread might leave a loaf at the door of a neighbor in need. Buckets of water were carried across fences, and bundles of firewood were left where others could find them. These simple acts of generosity gave life to those who struggled. More importantly, they gave hope, proving that kindness could flourish even in times of fear. The bonds of community also softened loneliness. Though families stayed apart physically, they found ways to remain connected. A voice calling over a fence, a song shared from one window to another, or a wave across the street reminded people that they were not alone. In silence, these gestures carried deep meaning. They revealed that companionship could exist even without touch or closeness. In larger towns, groups organized small networks of help. Volunteers carried supplies to isolated households, sometimes leaving baskets of food at doorways without entering. Leaders encouraged citizens to support the vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, and the poor through shared effort. These practices, though modest, built resilience across communities. They turned fear into action, showing that unity was as valuable as any medicine. Community also offered emotional strength. To know that others cared, even in small ways, lifted spirits during the hardest days. A kind word shouted across a street or a simple sign of support gave families courage. These gestures may seem small when measured against the scale of the plague, but their impact was immense. They created a thread of hope that connected one home to another, weaving a net of support across entire towns. Children often felt this power most strongly. Even when they could not play together as before, they exchanged smiles and greetings from safe distances. Parents encouraged these small connections, teaching their children that kindness must endure, even in hardship. In this way, the next generation learned resilience, not only through care in the home, but also through the compassion of neighbors. It was a quiet education in humanity. The poor, who suffered the most, often received support from those who had slightly more. In some cases, wealthier families distributed food or herbs to those in need. While not every act of generosity was perfect or consistent, each one mattered. To the struggling, even a single loaf of bread or a warm blanket could mean survival. Communities that embraced this responsibility endured with greater strength. Sometimes, communities formed protective rules together. Villagers agreed on when markets would open, how goods would be exchanged, or how travelers would be welcomed. These agreements reflected a shared understanding that survival required cooperation. Even if rules were inconvenient, the willingness to follow them for the sake of others showed a deep sense of unity. This collective discipline became another expression of community power. The power of community also appeared in storytelling. Families shared tales of endurance, reminding one another of past hardships that had been overcome. These stories encouraged patience, teaching that every trial eventually passed. Storytelling created a bridge between generations, binding people together through shared memory. In this way, the community's voice became a form of strength, speaking across both time and distance. Looking at these small yet powerful acts, we see that the plague was not only a test of the body, but of the human spirit. Community provided what medicine could not: hope, courage, and companionship. In moments of greatest fear, the bonds between neighbors became invisible armor. It was proof that survival was not a solitary effort, it was a shared journey. This is the lasting lesson of the power of community. In the countryside, the rhythm of farming made cooperation unavoidable. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, and harvests gathered, even during times of fear. Villagers often worked in turns, reducing contact while still ensuring the survival of crops. Those who were stronger helped those who were weaker, understanding that if one family failed, the entire community might suffer. In this way, agriculture itself became a lesson in unity, reminding people that food was not only a personal need, but a shared lifeline. In urban areas, guilds and associations also played a role. Bakers, butchers, and other tradesmen sometimes organized efforts to provide essentials at fair prices. These groups were not only about business but about responsibility to the larger town. By working together, they stabilized access to food and materials, ensuring that panic did not destroy daily life. The guild's cooperation showed that community existed not just in villages but also within the complex networks of cities. Acts of charity became remembered stories. Some families gave away more than they kept, inspiring others to do the same. Simple kindnesses multiplied, creating a ripple effect across communities. Even when wealth or resources were scarce, the willingness to share became a form of wealth in itself. These moments revealed that compassion can grow stronger in hardship than in ease. Community also played a role in caring for orphans and widows. When families lost members, neighbors sometimes stepped in to help raise children or support those left behind. This was not always easy, yet it demonstrated a commitment to preserving life beyond one's own household. The responsibility of care extended outward, creating safety nets in times when formal systems were weak or absent. These acts of guardianship ensured continuity of community across generations. The presence of community leaders gave additional structure. Local elders, respected for their wisdom, often guided decisions on safety and support. Their voices encouraged cooperation, reminding people that unity was stronger than fear. When panic threatened to divide towns, leaders emphasized shared responsibility. Their steady presence reassured families that even in chaos, order could be maintained through trust in one another. Even music and rituals carried out together at a distance strengthened community bonds. Villagers sometimes sang songs from doorways, creating a shared rhythm across streets. These sounds lifted spirits, giving a sense of togetherness despite physical separation. In such moments, communities remembered that unity could be felt not only through touch but through harmony of voice and intention. These practices provided hope in ways more powerful than silence. Looking back, the power of community reminds us that humans are not made to face hardship alone. The instinct to help, to share, and to endure together is as old as history itself. During the plague, these instincts were tested, but not broken. They emerged as quiet strengths, woven into the daily survival of entire regions. The legacy of this unity remains one of the most enduring lessons of the Middle Ages. Communities that embraced cooperation often endured with more resilience than those divided by fear. Their survival was not guaranteed, but their strength was multiplied by compassion. In times when knowledge was limited and remedies uncertain, unity itself became the greatest defense. It was not perfect, but it was powerful. It demonstrated that the human heart, when joined with others, could create stability where none seemed possible. The power of community also shaped memory. Families who survived remembered not only the illness, but also the kindness shown to them. These stories were passed down, becoming lessons for future generations. In this way, the memory of compassion outlasted the memory of despair. What endured most was not fear, but the bonds of care that carried people through. And so we close this segment on the power of community. We have seen neighbors share food, leaders guide towns, and voices rise in unison across quiet streets. These moments reveal that compassion is not only survival, but also legacy. If this story has brought you calm, I invite you gently to remain with the channel. For next, we will enter segment 9, Lessons in Resilience, where we will explore how hardship shaped strength across generations. When we look back at the story of the plague in the Middle Ages, what stands out most is not only the fear or the loss, but also the resilience that grew within people. Resilience is the quiet strength that allows a community to adapt, to endure, and to continue even when the world feels uncertain. The plague tested this strength in countless ways, and yet, again and again, humanity revealed its ability to survive. These lessons, though centuries old, still whisper to us across time. The first lesson in resilience came from observation. Without microscopes or modern medicine, people relied on their senses to notice patterns. They saw that sickness spread more quickly in crowded places, and so they learned to stay apart. They realized that fresh air seemed healthier, and so they opened windows when they felt it was safe. These adjustments were imperfect, but they showed the ability to learn, adapt, and act with caution. Another lesson was the value of patience. The plague did not vanish quickly. Families had to endure weeks, sometimes months, of uncertainty. This required a strength, not of sudden bravery, but of steady endurance. Each day brought challenges, but each day also taught the importance of waiting calmly for hardship to pass. Patience became a shield, protecting the heart from despair. Resilience also appeared in the way families found hope in small routines. The act of baking bread, tending a fire, or caring for animals became anchors in uncertain times. These habits reminded people that life continued, even when threatened. In holding on to these daily tasks, they carried forward a sense of normalcy that helped ease fear. Survival was not only about great acts of strength, but about holding fast to the ordinary. The power of memory offered another form of resilience. Elders reminded their families of past hardships, famines, winters, and wars that had been endured before. These stories taught that hardship was not new and that survival was possible. In remembering, people discovered courage. They recognized that difficulty was part of the human journey, and that endurance was woven into their history. Memory became both comfort and guide. Resilience also lived in kindness. Neighbors who shared food, families who cared for orphans, and communities that organized support all showed that survival was not only individual but collective. Compassion created strength that multiplied across households. Each act of generosity built resilience in both giver and receiver. In this way, kindness became more than a virtue, it became a survival strategy. Faith and reflection gave resilience to the spirit. In the silence of homes, people prayed, whispered words of comfort, and trusted that hardship would not last forever. These practices steadied hearts when fear threatened to overwhelm them. Even when medicine failed, the strength of the spirit endured. Resilience was not only found in the body's survival, but also in the calmness of the mind. Resilience showed itself in creativity as well. People invented new ways to trade, to communicate, and to care for one another while keeping distance. Signals, songs, and shared routines created connection even when physical closeness was impossible. This creativity turned obstacles into opportunities, proving that resilience is not only about strength but also about imagination. By reshaping daily life, people found ways to move forward. Children, too, became part of resilience. They learned to adapt quickly, playing games in smaller spaces, helping with tasks at home, and finding joy in small things. Their ability to smile and laugh, even in times of fear, gave hope to parents. Children carried the spirit of resilience without even knowing it, reminding families that life was still unfolding, still moving forward. Their innocence was a quiet strength in the darkest days. Finally, resilience appeared in recovery. When sickness passed through a household and healing began, families celebrated quietly, grateful for survival. These moments of recovery gave communities courage, showing that not all stories ended in despair. Survival itself became a lesson, proof that endurance could carry people through. Recovery was both relief and reminder. Resilience makes life possible even after hardship. Resilience was also taught through silence. In the quiet of nights, when only the sound of wind or distant bells could be heard, families sat together and endured without complaint. They knew that hardship could not always be changed, but it could be carried with dignity. This quiet acceptance was not surrender, but strength, the ability to face what could not be controlled with calm hearts. In stillness, resilience grew like roots beneath the surface. Another form of resilience appeared in the rebuilding that followed each wave of sickness. When the plague receded, communities reopened markets, replanted fields, and repaired homes. The return to normal life was never immediate, but the determination to restore what had been lost revealed human strength. Rebuilding showed that resilience is not only about enduring hardship, but also about rising after it. These acts of renewal gave shape to hope. The lessons of resilience were often shared across generations. Parents taught children through example, showing them patience, generosity, and courage. Stories of survival became part of family identity, passed down as quiet instructions for the future. In this way, resilience was not only lived, but also inherited. It became a thread connecting past, present, and future. Resilience also carried a lesson in humility. The plague reminded people that life is fragile, and that certainty is never guaranteed. In response, many learned to live with greater gratitude for small blessings: food, family, and health. This gratitude created strength, for it turned attention away from loss and toward what remained. Humility before life's uncertainty became another form of endurance. Communities that practiced resilience discovered that hardship could shape identity. Villages remembered their cooperation, their acts of kindness, and their endurance as part of their story. These memories became sources of pride, even in later years. To say, "we endured," was to declare strength. The collective identity of resilience gave meaning to the suffering, ensuring it was not endured in vain. For individuals, resilience often came from love. The desire to protect family, to care for children, or to support neighbors gave people motivation to endure. Love created purpose, and purpose created strength. In this way, resilience was born not only of necessity, but of affection. Even in fear, the bonds of love reminded people why survival mattered. Resilience was also linked to adaptability. People learned to adjust habits, routines, and traditions to meet the needs of crisis. This flexibility became a lasting lesson that to survive, one must be willing to change. Stubbornness could bring harm, but adaptability opened the path to endurance. Through this lesson, resilience taught that strength is not rigid, but gentle and bending like a tree in the wind. Looking back, resilience reveals itself as a collection of small acts rather than great victories. A loaf of bread shared, a moment of patience, a quiet prayer, or a kind word, these were the building blocks of survival. No single act was grand, but together, they created a foundation strong enough to endure the plague. This truth reminds us that resilience is often hidden in the ordinary. The legacy of resilience outlived the plague itself. Long after the sickness passed, communities remembered the ways they had endured. These memories influenced how future generations faced challenges, shaping a culture of endurance. The lessons of resilience became part of the history of Europe, written not only in books, but in daily habits and traditions. Hardship became teacher, and resilience became student. And so we close this segment on lessons in resilience. We have seen how patience, kindness, memory, and adaptability shaped survival. These qualities carried people through darkness and into light, proving that the human spirit can endure more than it imagines. If this telling has brought you calm, I invite you gently to remain with the channel. For soon, we will enter segment 10A, Quiet Ending, where we reflect on how the story of the plague settled into memory and what it leaves behind for us today. As the years passed and the waves of plague began to settle, life in the Middle Ages slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The silence that had once filled markets gave way to the sounds of trade again. Fields, once left untended, began to bloom with new harvests. Families who had endured hardships sought to rebuild their homes and their lives. Though scars remained, the world moved forward with a kind of quiet determination. The ending of the plague did not arrive in a single moment. It faded gradually, like the slow dimming of a storm cloud across the sky. Some towns recovered sooner than others, while in certain places the sickness lingered. But eventually, its grip loosened, and the rhythm of daily life began to return. For survivors, this return was both a relief and a reminder of what had been endured. In villages, the first signs of recovery were simple. Markets reopened, gatherings returned, and festivals were held again. People came together cautiously at first, testing the safety of closeness. Slowly, laughter returned to streets that had once been silent. The joy of ordinary moments felt new and precious, as if rediscovered after being forgotten. Communities realized that even the simplest gatherings carried deep value. For families, recovery meant rebuilding routines. Children returned to play in open fields, while parents focused on tending crops and repairing homes. The act of returning to work gave purpose, helping to restore both body and spirit. In these small tasks, people found healing. Life moved forward not through sudden change, but through the steady rhythm of daily effort. Memory of the plague, however, remained strong. Families carried the stories of loss and survival, teaching younger generations about resilience. The past was not easily forgotten, but it was turned into wisdom. People reminded one another that hardship, though painful, could be endured. These memories became part of community identity, shaping how they faced future challenges. The ending also brought gratitude. Survivors cherished the gift of health, food, and companionship with new appreciation. Small blessings that had once been overlooked became precious. A loaf of bread, a warm fire, or a friendly visit each carried more meaning than before. Gratitude turned ordinary life into something extraordinary, teaching people to value what they once took for granted. In larger towns, leaders worked to strengthen communities for the future. They improved systems of cleanliness, organized better responses to illness, and encouraged cooperation. Though knowledge remained limited, experience had taught valuable lessons. These efforts reflected the human desire not only to survive but to prepare, ensuring that the memory of hardship was not wasted. Progress, however slow, grew out of difficulty. For children who had lived through the plague, the quiet ending marked a new beginning. They grew up carrying lessons of resilience, compassion, and endurance. These lessons shaped their adulthood, influencing how they raised families and guided communities. The memory of hardship became part of their character, reminding them always of the strength found in patience and kindness. In this way, The ending of the plague shaped the future through the children who had endured it. The quiet ending also revealed the strength of faith and reflection. Many continued the habits they had developed during hardship: daily prayers, acts of kindness, and moments of reflection. These practices, once born of fear, became traditions of calm and gratitude. They offered stability even after the plague had passed, weaving endurance into the fabric of daily life. In this way, the spiritual resilience of the people became one of the most lasting legacies. Looking at the quiet ending, we see not only survival but renewal. Life did not return unchanged, but transformed. People valued community, family, and compassion more deeply than before. Hardship had stripped life down to its essentials, and in rebuilding, those essentials were cherished. The quiet ending of the plague was not only the close of suffering, but the beginning of wisdom that would last for centuries. The quiet ending of the plague also brought reflection on the meaning of time. For those who had endured months of uncertainty, each new season carried deeper significance. Spring was no longer just planting, it was renewal. Summer was not only work, it was abundance. Autumn and winter became reminders of the cycles of life, of hardship followed by recovery. This deeper awareness shaped how people saw the passage of days, giving new value to time itself. Communities learned that strength was not found in isolation alone, but in balance. Staying apart had protected many, but rebuilding required coming together again. The return of shared labor, trade, and gatherings reminded people that life could only be complete with connection. The quiet ending taught them to respect both caution and closeness, showing that survival required both separation and unity. These lessons became woven into the social fabric of medieval Europe. The memory of compassion became one of the most treasured legacies. Families remembered who had brought them food, who had spoken words of comfort, and who had stayed loyal during fear. These acts of kindness were not forgotten, they became part of stories told for generations. Communities realized that it was not wealth or status that mattered most in crisis, but generosity. Compassion, once given, became eternal in memory. Resilience became a heritage, passed from survivors to their children and grandchildren. Stories of endurance, once told around firesides, shaped the identities of families and villagers. Children grew up knowing that their people had faced darkness and emerged stronger. This heritage was not written in grand monuments, but in daily habits: patience, gratitude, and kindness. In this way, the quiet ending of the plague created a future rooted in strength. As time moved forward, the world did not remain free of hardship. Other trials would come: wars, famines, and new illnesses. But the memory of the plague remained as a guide. It reminded people that even the darkest storms eventually pass, and that survival depends on unity, patience, and compassion. The quiet ending became more than history, it became a teacher. Even centuries later, the story of the plague still whispers lessons. It tells us that humanity has always faced uncertainty, yet has always found ways to endure. It reminds us that resilience is not extraordinary but ordinary, woven into daily acts of love and care. The quiet ending shows that hope is never lost, even when the world feels fragile. These lessons remain timeless, echoing softly across history. For those who survived, the ending was not a celebration but a gentle exhale. There were no grand feasts or parades, only the return of normal life. And perhaps that was the greatest gift: to walk in markets again, to hear laughter, to sit at a table with family. Ordinary moments became extraordinary treasures. The quiet ending taught that survival itself was enough to celebrate. Looking back, we see that the story of the plague is not only about suffering, it is also about endurance, compassion, and renewal. The quiet ending shows us that humanity is stronger than despair, that communities can rebuild, and that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. These truths remain as relevant now as they were in the Middle Ages. The story ends softly, but its lessons remain strong. And so, as we close this journey through history, let us remember the resilience of those who lived long before us. Their trials remind us that hardship is part of life, but so is endurance. Their compassion reminds us that kindness is the most lasting form of strength. Their patience reminds us that storms pass, leaving behind wisdom for those who follow. In their quiet ending, we find inspiration for our own lives today. If you have listened this far, I thank you for joining in this calm exploration. If you wish to rest peacefully with more gentle history, I invite you softly to like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. In the next journey, we will travel even further back in time to explore how did people survive the Ice Age. Until then, may these stories carry you into calm rest, reminding you that even in history's darkest chapters, light always returns.